Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom, like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
There's never been a faster or easier way to start your weight loss journey than with PlushCare. PlushCare accepts most insurance plans and gives you online access to board-certified physicians who can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Take charge of your health and speak with a board-certified physician about a weight loss plan that's right for you. Get started today at plushcare.com/weight loss. That's plushcare.com/weight loss. plushcare.com/weight loss.
Hello and welcome to The Napoleonicist. It's day 2 of Waterloo Remembered, and today we're starting the first of a triple bill of interviews on one of the most important yet most neglected topics on Waterloo, the forgotten foreign forces. I'm delighted to be joined by Hayley Stewart, a historian from the University of North Texas, specializing in Anglo-German relations during the Napoleonic era. Hayley, it's great to have you here. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm very
Thanks
well.
for having me.
And thank you for coming on the show. Tell us a little bit about your research.
My current research is dealing with the relationship between Britain and Hanover, and more specifically, the diplomatic relations between Britain and Hanover. And so what I'm looking at are the methods that Britain employed to manage North Germany, protect their economic interest and their maritime rights in the north, and how Hanover plays into that. While maintaining this balance of power, there's this kind of level that I see emerge where, yes, they're maintaining the balance of power, but they're also using imperial methods of overseeing disjointed group in the kind of Holy Roman Empire, and how they're playing the Prussians and the Bavarians and the Saxons, and leveraging Hanover, to navigate the complexity of relations going on there. And so that's what my research is looking at, and it's looking at the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era, because that period really kind of messes with things, right? It brings things into conflict. This effort at George III to manage Hanover and Britain separately, which scholarship has shown pretty convincingly that he tries to, and then the Napoleonic Wars kind of mess all of that up, if you will, and it throws those efforts to operate distinctly together. Because France, even Prussia, uses the language where they view Hanover as a continental British possession. Even though they are composite states, in which they are separate states but share a same sovereign, they still view them that way. And sometimes the way that your enemy views things is just as important as how you view them, right? And it plays into your strategy. So that's a lot of what I'm looking at in my current research.
Fantastic. And is that going to be turned into a book?
Yes, much more work I'll have to do for the book project, because there's so many things that you have to leave out, right, in the process of kind of constructing the dissertation, what we call the dissertation. And so there's more work, but yes, ideally that's the goal, is eventually turning it into a book.
It sounds like a really interesting piece of research. I'm looking forward to seeing the end product of it. One of the most enduring yet frustrating myths, in my opinion, about Waterloo is that Waterloo was a British victory, and that people like to take the involvement of the Prussians under Blucher and massively downplay the vital role that they played. But then when it comes to the role of Dutch and Belgian forces and the King's German Legion, that's almost been forgotten entirely, which has always struck me as just a willful misremembering of the reality of the international effort that Waterloo represented. Tell us about the King's German Legion, first of all. Who were they?
I agree with you about this myth that you find so interesting, and I think it's kind of a product of coalition warfare, and a difference between the military and political aspects, right? The framing of conflict afterward, or how we remember it, and I think in this coalition warfare, that tends to happen. Right, you're not thinking of the composition of the armies or what is being made up of them, and this really is too. Not unusual for the British way of war on the continent, right? To have this coalition warfare to subsidize German troops. So it's almost as it's normal, right? To constitute it as a British victory, even if it is made up of these foreign troops. And so the King's German Legion, as you said, is part of this. And the King's German Legion emerges as a result of the French invasion of Hanover in 1803 and the restarting of conflict on the continent. And it's kind of an interesting evolution that happens over a period of several months. You have General Mortier march into Hanover. The first capitulation that the Hanoverians sign, George III refuses to agree to it. There's then a second capitulation because they're trying to, Hawkesbury is the foreign minister, and then you have the German advisor Lintha, and they're trying to organize a way to get some of the Hanoverian troops off the continent and to England, because this changes dynamics for British recruitment, right, of troops, because you have Prussia in their situation, you don't have France controlling a large portion of the territory, so recruiting troops would be a problematic event for England, so they're trying to organize this. They're not able to effectively organize the operation the way they want to, but they end up, because there are English vessels off the coast of Germany, going to get possessions of George III's that are in Hanover because of this invasion. And they kind of organize and offer these Hanoverian troops the option to come to England, right? So over the few months after the invasion of Hanover, you have Frederick von der Decken, who's a Hanoverian troop who's very much back and forth. He's close to Prince Adolphus, the Duke of Cambridge, and he's part of this organizing of these troops. And at first, it's just infantry, and they're referred to as the King's German Regiment. And then they have so many, they're able to recruit so many troops in this that they've been able to form cavalry units and artillery units. And then in December of 1803, they are officially established as the King's German Legion. And what's so interesting about them is they are under the British Army. You know, they are part of the British Army. And for military personnel, it was almost kind of course, you know, this is an easy way of moving them in. The political side is less convincing. Of course, Parliament and opposition politics and the component of Hanover involved in that, but they eventually also recognize the value of the King's German Legion, and they, you know, agree to make them part of the British Army. They just can't command troops, you know, in the British Isles. So there are some distinctions that play into the fears, right, that exist there. So it's really an interesting group, and it is largely made up of Hanoverians, especially in the early years. They first see combat in 1805, and so those early years is predominantly Hanoverian, but then of course it's mostly German, because, you know, from all the various places within the Holy Roman Empire, but there's also Dutch and Swiss and other groups that are also part of this King's German Legion. And so I would say toward the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you probably have fewer Hanoverians than in the earlier part, but it is largely made up of Germans nonetheless for the whole time. So it is really a very interesting, I guess, kind of collaboration and kind of an interesting social case study too, right, of these Anglo-German troops and the languages and the structure and all of that, kind of the English and the German collaboration, hybrid, if you will.
Absolutely, and they gain quite a formidable reputation, particularly when they served under Wellington during the Peninsular War. I mean, troops from Germany have a long history of being quite highly respected by British forces, it's worth saying. But within Wellington's army, they really are regarded as utterly dependable. I personally quite often come across admiring comments about them by British soldiers at a time when there was a degree of xenophobia, particularly when you look at attitudes towards Spanish troops and perhaps to a lesser extent towards Portuguese troops. But at the same time, that quality had sort of been watered down over the course of the Napoleonic Wars, hadn't it? By virtue of having to recruit from further afield, not just from Hanover, but from a wide variety of German states, and in some cases taking deserters. So as a corps, what's your sense of the KGL, its reputation and its real status at the time of Waterloo?
There's been really good work done on the King's German Legion, and Mark Wishon it's not just the King's German Legion, but he has a book on German forces in the British Army. And one of his case studies is on the King's German Legion. And he does a really good assessment of what you're talking about, this respectability, right, of the King's German Legion. And he makes a fantastic point that it starts with the cavalry, right, the hussars. It starts with the cavalry and the way they're kind of eulogized and they're talked about because of their effectiveness. And that respect for the cavalry then kind of bleeds into the other components, right? Like it impacts the view of the King's German Legion, which it makes sense because Hanover and horses, horses, cavalry are a big part of the military kind of mentality. So it makes sense. But then that kind of respectability for the cavalry, of course, then shifts into respectability for the infantry and artillery. And in some of what you're talking about, I've read some of those, the way they speak of them. And it gets really into, you see the British troops comment on this, what we call a martial race, right? When they're fighting with these German troops and these Hanoverian troops. And they very much see them. It's not that they just happen to be good soldiers. For them, it's that it's linked to them being German, right? This kind of martial tendency that they have. And the British troops really recognize that. And I think that also lends to the difference in military culture, right? Britain. I mean, we're sitting here talking about Waterloo and Wellington and the British Army and these coalition forces and this great battle, this incredibly important battle. But for Britain, it's still the Navy, so the Army culture is very different for them than the continental, Army culture. And I think they recognize some of that. And I also think it's different. The military, I don't know, I'm going to use this word, but the military public sphere, the people who are actively in the military, or maybe they are policymakers, they recognize the importance of German aid, of coalition forces in a completely different way. And so I think you see a lot more of what we're talking about here, of recognition of effectiveness because of that, right? War is hell, and they recognize the importance of having effective troops fighting alongside them in a lot of instances. I also have seen mentioned that the Germans are really good at outpost duty. And I think Wishon talks about this, and that the British were kind of deficient in that area. So they gained respect for some of these things that they were good at that perhaps maybe the British were not as effective at. And that kind of shapes that. Now you see a lot more, I guess you say contentions, disagreements more at the command level, but you're going to get more of that, between maybe British and German officers. But enlisted men, it's a little bit different. And I think they're kind of shocked, if you will, a bit that they get on so well in some instances.
I mean, it's interesting what you said about outpost duty. I wonder if there's just sort of a greater tendency amongst British soldiers or drunk on outpost duty, and perhaps the Germans are just a little bit better disciplined. That's an interesting point actually about discipline.
It is. And I think that's part of that military culture that we're talking about. And that doesn't mean that the Germans can't have, new green recruits who are going to, be shaken by, first gunfire or anything like that. But they're more comfortable, if you will, culturally with an army. And it's kind of part of, you think about Prussia and discipline and the military structure. I do think it's part of military culture.
Do you think culturally it's easier for the British perhaps to identify with the German Legion than it is to identify with the Spanish and the Portuguese, bearing in mind the religious cultural difference?
Yeah, I do, because I don't think you can take, it's so persistent throughout the 18th century. Would you agree?
Completely.
Even if you're not particularly religious, like maybe your religious convictions aren't as strong, it's embedded in the culture. You can't read anything without the Protestant Catholic dynamics coming up in the language, right? And so the whole point of establishing George I after Queen Anne's death was because of the Lutheran Protestant connection. There were closer people, but they were Catholic. So I do think that is something that is there. Also, there's the longstanding Anglo-German relationship, North German too, not just with Austria, but with Prussia. And even when there's conflict, even when there's disagreement, there's still this persistent relationship, in the sense of they're going to work together, right? This coalition, even if they disagree. So there is a little bit different relationship than with your Spanish and Portuguese, definitely. And think about the conflict with Spain, the historical conflict with Spain, the connection to the French too, right? All is kind of wrapped up into that. So I do think some of those cultural things aided, if you will, in the unity that the King's German Legion was able to develop within the British Army.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. What was the KGL's role in the Waterloo campaign?
The biggest in the Waterloo campaign, the most famous, role of the King's German Legion is their defense of Le Haye-Saint, where Brennan Sims has the book The Longest Afternoon, where he details, right, the King's German Legion is defense of this farmhouse, this farmstead. And it's actually quite extraordinary. He would argue that it's one of the most pivotal moments of the entire battle. They're maintaining their defense because there's several they're going to take several waves, if you will, of attack. And they're facing this, what seems like an inevitable destruction, right? Even in their maintaining hold of this farmstead, and they continue on. So the defense of the farmstead really gets going, if you will, in the afternoon on the 18th of June. Napoleon had that morning given orders for the attack on Hougoumont as kind of a diversion to kind of hold up troops. And then in the afternoon on the 18th, he starts with, because his main attack is going to be at the center, right? It's going to be a frontal assault at the center of Wellington's line, trying to push through this farmstead. When Napoleon looks out, he doesn't see any defenses. There's not any defenses. The King's German Legion kind of hastily tries to fortify some of their positions around, but Napoleon can't really see it. He's wanting to push through and then tank Mont Saint-Jean, right, and kind of disrupt Wellington's line of communication. So he starts with this artillery barrage of the farmstead, which isn't as effective as it could be, right? The cannons sink in the mud. They don't bounce for full effectiveness. There's some places that are hit, but he starts with that. And then he gives D'Erlon the order to, start the assault on the farmstead. That's kind of the first wave, and he leads that attack. They end up taking the orchard and the garden in that first attack, and then you have the British cavalry. So that's kind of the first wave. Then you have Ney, right, come in with this second wave, and there's a lot of question of what Ney was thinking, right, with this cavalry assault of the center again. Like, why did he lead this assault without infantry support, different things like that. And I've read some things. I've read that he looks back and he thinks Wellington is retreating, when really it's just something else kind of happening off in the distance. But for whatever reason, he leads this cavalry charge without infantry support on the farmstead. They hold their positions. It doesn't go well. And then, so it keeps going. The whole point of this defense really is that they're tying the French up. They're delaying the French. They're holding the line. They're not allowing the French to break through at the moment where the French could capitalize on it, right? And while all of these assaults are happening, the Prussians are slowly trickling in, right? More and more Prussians are starting to arrive. And so by the kind of end of the day, you have this last fourth assault, which is kind of the big one, and Ney is leading it again, and he succeeds. I mean, the King's German Legion at this point, you have Major George Bering, who's commanding this group, who's at the farmstead, the 2nd Light Battalion specifically, and then there's other groups around it, and they're out of ammunition. They didn't have enough ammunition to make it through the whole afternoon to begin with. Some of this has to do with, like, Wellington couldn't resupply ammunition because it had to do their riflemen, and the ammunition was different for their guns than what they had. They had lost some of their ammunition on the retreat earlier, so they're running out of ammunition. And in this last kind of assault here, Ney succeeds, and kind of forcing the King's German Legion to retreat. But by the time he does that, there's no one to reinforce him. Ney's calling for reinforcements so he can break through the line and continue, but they're not there, because by that point, the Prussians have arrived more number, and Napoleon and everybody's focus, is on dealing with the Prussians. So the most vulnerable point, I guess you could say, of the King's German Legion holding the line is when Ney breaks through there in that fourth assault. But by that point, there's no support for him to actually capitalize on it, or for the French to capitalize on it. And so their defense of the farmstead, why it's considered such a crucial moment, is because of the defense of holding out long enough, right, for the Prussians to arrive and to completely kind of change the dynamics, of the conflict. And so it's admirable, because only 40 something of this 2nd Light Battalion survive. Bering's one of them, the famous Frederick Lindau, his accounts of that same battle, he survives as well, but there's very few. So it was self-sacrificing in a lot of ways, to hold that position long enough for the other groups to do what they were supposed to do.
It says a lot about not only the fighting spirit of the KGL, that they stay until the ammunition runs out, more or less, yeah, and then they fight their way out with bayonets. It's not sort of, we're down to the last couple of rounds, let's get out now. And the butts
of their rifles. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then there's this disastrous assault that's ordered, well, it's vetoed by the Prince of Orange, isn't there? Ompteder's attack to try and retake the farmhouse, because its position in the centre, barely 300 yards from the Allied lines, became, or had the potential to become, such an important fire base. As we're seeing later in the battle, when the French put artillery in the complex, that Ompteder's, was it a brigade that he had? I think it was a brigade, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
Was sent for to try and retake the farm, and that went disastrously wrong.
It went disastrously wrong. It fails, and So he, one of the things I find really interesting about this is that what I've read is that Wellington, like they don't necessarily, yes, it's the center, right? It's right in front of, protecting the line and all that. But before this battle, they're not necessarily organizing it, if you will, in a way that suggests it's the most important part of the line, right? Like there's no working about defense. It's almost an afterthought of how important it is. There's not really this preparation. So you have these 400 men, but they're over the whole hours. It's like several hours that they're fighting here. There's 800 other reinforcements from different groups, like you're talking about. Tita bringing in the brigade and other reinforcements to support them, in addition to the 400. This is the 400 are right smack dab in the middle. But I find it interesting, what we're talking about, it being important defensively, but that kind of comes later. Like there's the prep isn't there. The preparation isn't there beforehand. So it almost reads, Major George Bering has his account, right, of the entire battle. And if you read his account, it's almost like a meat grinder. They're throwing men at these French assaults. And with Pita, like there's a lot of what appears as poor decision making or bad choices to charge when you're not, like they're not having a lot of forethought, if you will, on what they're doing. But I think that speaks to the intensity of the moment and to the intensity of the fighting that's happening right there, where you get a sense of desperation, right, to drive them back in any possible way you can. So within that, you get a lot of mistakes, a lot of uncalculated mistakes. And in the region itself, right, you have the slope, and so they try to attack there, and things kind of go poorly wrong when they're trying to do that. And so the region itself and their positioning, I think, also lends to some of the poor decision making on counterattacks, if you will, the effectiveness of their counterattacks. The accounts that we have of it are quite incredible, and we have a lot of images as well of it, depictions of the defense of it as well, that kind of provide a visual of the fighting and the brutality of the fighting, the massive death that happens at this central position as well.
We should also talk about the Brunswickers, shouldn't we? Who played a pretty important role in the Battle of Quatre Bras on the 16th of June. What's the history of the Brunswick troops in the Napoleonic Wars prior to Waterloo, first of all?
The Brunswick troops are incredibly interesting. And I think this, something that you see in the Brunswick troops is something that you're seeing in a lot of the King's German Legion troops and a lot of the German troops that are fighting under the British Army, which is rid Germany of the French, right? And you really see this in the Brunswick troops. So Frederick, the Duke of Brunswick, is who raises these Brunswickers. He's the son of Charles, the Duke of Brunswick, the famous Duke of Brunswick, who dies at Jena Auerstadt in 1806. And then Frederick, of course, becomes the Duke of Brunswick. And in 1809, when you have the beginnings of the Fifth Coalition with Britain and Austria, he wants to be involved in this, and he works with Austria to, in his own money, he uses his own money, but with support of Austria to raise these Brunswickers. I think it's like 2,300 or something like that of them at the beginning, and they fight alongside Austria. He briefly retakes Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel from the French in 1809, but it's only briefly, and then he loses it again. And then he goes to England because his sister is, of course, Caroline, the Princess of Wales, who's married to George IV. And so when they go to England, then the Brunswick troops are, he agrees to fight alongside the British, and they start fighting with the British. And so some of the most famous fighting is in the Peninsular Campaign, with these Brunswick troops. And then after kind of the end of that, he ends up going back about 1813 to reclaim his territory after they drive the French out. And so then in 1815, right, when Napoleon comes back, and Prussia and Britain are trying to organize this coalition, he agrees to raise troops again under the Brunswick line and fight with the coalition. And so one of the things I think is really key in this 100 Days campaign and this Waterloo campaign is that these are not the same troops, right? Like, I mean, this is a different level of troop that we're dealing with than, say, in those early wars for the French, but also for the Prussians and the British. A lot of them are new, and some of the Brunswickers too. A lot of them are fresh recruits, had not necessarily seen, conflicts. So it's a different group than, say, the Brunswickers, of the Peninsular Campaign that we're going to see at Quatre Bras. And I think that impacts, their experiences there, and maybe the perceptions of their fighting.
And seeing as you've just said about Waterloo, at Quatre Bras, they have a pretty rough time, don't they? I mean, not least losing their leader, but also taking a lot of casualties.
They take a lot of casualties, and I think that lends to what we were talking about with the different troops, the different situation of troops. Even for the British, right? You have the War of 1812 going on, so you have a number of British troops who are dealing with that conflict, and then you have the British troops along with their coalition members, and so it's a very different. You have your seasoned soldiers, of course, but you also have a lot of unseasoned soldiers, and so at Quatre Bras, the Brunswickers are sent in the afternoon to reinforce some of the other positions, and Wellington gives them the orders to advance on the French. And they don't have their guns. Their artillery is far away, and by the time they had received the orders, the artillery couldn't make it to where the Brunswickers were, so they don't have their guns. And so when they advance on the French pull out their battery and start waylaying the Brunswickers, right? Now Frederick, the Duke of Brunswick, asks Wellington, for some guns, and they end up giving them a few, but it doesn't help them as much, as they had hoped. They do, advance further, and the French end up, pushing them back. In the process of that, they're inflicting heavy casualties, but in the process of that, this is where the green, fresh troop thing comes in. In their retreat from the French advance, they scatter, right? They lose confidence. They kind of are, I don't say they're starting to desert, but they're falling apart, if you will. And the Duke of Brunswick tries to reinstitute order and discipline, and he does. He's able to get them to rally, but then he ends up being shot and killed in the process of that. And so after that, the Brunswickers aren't gone. After that, one of his other generals, like Offerman, ends up taking over command of the Brunswickers. And then you see them also fighting in Waterloo as well after that, just without their leader. But some of the references, the British soldiers talking about the Brunswickers and their, I guess you could say, shoddy performance at Quatre Bras, I think it goes to some of those things that are just part of armies, and perhaps some of it is perception too, right? Like what the perception of the Brunswickers was, what fighting in the Peninsular Campaign and all of the things that they did. And then you have, a different group, a kind of fresher recruit group who's not necessarily has the discipline to stand, and so the Duke of Brunswick is having to kind of manage some of that. So I think some of that comes from that, or, some of the criticisms, if you will, comes from managing these less disciplined troops. Let's say that.
It's interesting what you say about the British troops, because they seem to have viewed the actions of the Brunswickers quite harshly, because they broke at they broke at Quatre Bras, but then of course they rallied. And they did the same thing when they were attacked by Napoleon's Guard at Waterloo, but again rallied, which ultimately is what you need men to do in a situation, isn't it? If they are, obviously you don't want them to break, but if they are going to break, you need them to rally, reform and return to the fight, which in fairness, we should say, is what the Brunswickers do at both battles. I can't remember if it was Wellington who said this, but there was certainly a prominent commander who said that he never blamed men for running away so long as they reformed again afterwards. I need to double check if that was actually Wellington. What's your assessment of their performance? Were the British unduly harsh?
I think unduly harsh is almost, semantics. What does unduly harsh mean? And I think sometimes our initial responses to things are much harsher than when we sit on them and think about them. And so when I think about unduly harsh, I don't know what's unduly harsh. The British soldiers are, responding in real time to what they see. And so breaking, is cowardice. It's not following, what you're supposed to be doing. So that initial response is that we don't always, as human beings, like this is as a kind of a component that I always think about, don't always think about what happens in the end, right? It's our initial response that fills us with emotion and causes us to react, not necessarily how things end up turning out. So if, since you can't remember Wellington, whatever British commander's saying, then I don't care if they break as long as they rally and go back. That's a command perspective, right? Because it's this understanding of you can't necessarily harp on all the perfections of these things. What you need them to do is fight when you need them to fight. So British soldiers saying unduly harsh, yes and no. It's no in the sense that they're fighting with them, they're witnessing this, they're going to comment on what they see as cowardice or not holding the line, right? But at the same time, if we look back and step at it in a broader picture, maybe it is too harsh because ultimately in the end, they do what they're supposed to do, right? So I think that's just, those are the tidbits that are so fantastic about having written accounts of these battles from soldiers fighting it, is that you're getting a lot of those responses, and they're very real responses. I mean, if I put myself in their shoes, I probably would have commented on the fact that the Brunswickers keep breaking. So I don't think it's unduly harsh in the sense that they had this comment, they had this perception, but in the whole bigger picture, the importance is did they rally and did they do what they were supposed to do in the end? Even if it was maybe a zigzag to get there, right? A much more complicated process than what needed to be. So, which I think those are the interesting dynamics that we're constantly wrestling with, right? As historians in general, is what do these things mean and how do they see them? And did they hold on to that? Was it a fleeting passing emotion?
Absolutely. I mean, the single most dangerous thing you can do is forget the human element in conflict, which is probably why we spend so much time arguing about Waterloo. I must say, if I'd been at Waterloo, I'd have probably been with the Brunswicks. I would have broken and run, and I probably wouldn't have stopped running. I have to ask you the big question. And to be honest, it's probably a question that nobody's ever going to have the definitive answer to. But that's not intended as an insult to you. It's just such a complex question.
That's the fun in the conversation. Like that's, yeah. No.
Why do you think there is this tendency to downplay foreign forces at Waterloo from the British perspective? Because the fact that you have the King's German Legion at La Haye-Sainte, you've got Dutch troops alongside the British Guard at Hougoumont, says so much about Wellington's trust in them to hold their own and fight well.
This is one of those questions, like you said, no one's ever going to have a definitive answer. Everybody's going to have an opinion. And it's also one of those questions where you always feel like you have to walk the fine line, right? Between saying something incredibly controversial and maintaining balance. And I think, like you mentioned about Wellington, and what this says about Wellington's trust. I think Wellington did have trust in them. This goes back to that military sphere, the way they think about fighting, their troops, and so on. Even with all the conflict and the disagreements and the distrust and the mistrust between, say, Blucher and Wellington, you still have respect there. Like it comes through in everything I've read. Respect for them as each other as commanders, respect for their profession. So it's kind of a different world, I think, than the world of historical memory or the world of the public. So I think you're right. Wellington did have trust in them. I think he did trust them to hold their own and fight well. But I think that's the difference. Also, Wellington was much more politically astute, right? Like, he's not just a commander in the British Army. He's also very tapped into the politics, which I think you have less, say with the Prussians, for example, because they're different, completely different structure, king, kind of monarchy, all of this. So this, to me, all of these powers have very, what I would call, typical behaviors. Okay. The way they talk to each other, the way they conceive of their policy, the way they conceive of their politics, the way they conceive of this war and what they're fighting this war for. Which is obviously throughout the whole Napoleonic Wars, right? This whole problem with the coalition warfare and everyone seeking their own interest and the historical competitions that exist there. And I think what happens here is, for the British, like you were talking about downplaying foreign forces, I don't want to say they always do it, but it's, to me, the way they're fighting this war with the coalition forces, with foreign forces, is a lot of the way, even with their own British troops, they have been fighting other continental wars. Right. So I think the British see it as a British victory. I don't think they really think about I mean, they're aware of it. Like, they're not, ignorant of the fact that they recruit Germans and Dutch and Swiss and all of these things into their war. But I still think, even with the coalition, because it's Wellington, with command, that it is a British victory. And when you're talking about it, it's British and Prussia. It's these two countries broadly, from a broad perspective, and the British win. And that's the way the narrative goes, right? They're not like, wait, hold on, let me tell you about all of these people who were fighting under the British Army who were not British at all, right? So I think it comes with the historical memory, the way after conflict you have, I don't want to say they're rewriting, but you can't escape the political, right, of war. And so the framing of this, because for the British, even when I'm studying North German, Anglo-Hanoverian, Prussian relations, for the British, this is always a war between Britain and France. And it's these two superpowers, right? The British with their naval supremacy and control of the seas, and the French with their army and continental forces. And this kind of dichotomy permeates everything. And so even at Waterloo, it's the perception of the way they've been fighting this war. It's Britain finally defeating their French nemesis, which, to be fair, had been going on for the whole century, right? And so I think a lot of those political things, a lot of those ways of framing the conflict, of thinking about the conflict, play into the way it's talked about afterward. So the Prussians are the big one that's harder to downplay, because they're, their entire force in their own right. But I think that's what happens in this, is in the process of a lot of that, the minutia gets kind of pushed away, and that is who's actually fighting in this British Army, right? The actual makeup of it.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. There is that temptation, particularly when you're trying to write episodes like this into the history of your own nation, to just go, they were British, let's focus on the British examples, because we're creating this British narrative of the history of our nation.
Absolutely. And this goes into historical memory in general. I mean, if we think about it, so English, right, is the dominant language of British history, and of course American too. So you have this large swath of scholarship that's in English, and so people in English-speaking nations are writing histories. The English, you can read those histories, right? So a lot of the German perspectives or the Dutch perspectives or whatever are written in German, more so than they are in English. So then you get availability of scholarship, right? And who can read it. So if we're talking about British history, and of course you're going to, as a British historian, look at the angle from the British angle, right? That's what happens. But because of that, that means the more scholarship on it is in English. And so that, the focus is on Wellington, and the focus is on the British Army, and the focus is on some of these different things. Whereas it's harder to access a lot more of the continental accounts if they're not published in English too. So if we're talking about long-standing memory and how, that familiarizes us with certain narratives, I think that contributes too. But I would say it's gotten so much better. The scholarship, the work that's been done on Prussia, the work that's been done on the King's German Legion, the work that's been done on all these troops, I think it's better than it's ever been. And there's much more access in English to some of these things. So I think that tendency is kind of fading, if you will, even if it's still strong, because of the work that's been printed in English, and that can kind of change the understanding of these events, if you will.
Do you think Wellington had any role to play in how it was remembered, in the sense that when you look at the Waterloo Dispatch, one of the things that people sometimes pick up on is the fact that you've got this very lengthy letter to the British government reporting on his actions, and he's quite open about the importance of the Prussians, particularly at the closing stages, but it comes down to maybe a paragraph and a half almost at the end of the letter. Do you think, because there are two ways of arguing that, aren't there, that he's deliberately paying lip service to the role of Blücher and the Prussians because he's got to do that, and he's got to continue the campaign and continue to foster that working relationship. But then the flip side is that his role is to write to the British government about his actions and the forces under his command. What's your sense of how that plays out?
I think it's sometimes both, because I'm really one of those people. People probably will hate me for that, but I'm one of those people that I'm not an all or nothing person, and I don't think things work that way, because I don't think in real time anything ever works that way. So in a sense, I think it's a little bit of both. I think Wellington's in tune with what his government wants to hear, and I think he's in tune with how he is representing himself for his own future. I mean, think about Wellington. He's Irish, so he already has, these other components kind of working against him, and his command and his success militarily is something that allowed him, to move up and forward. So I think he's aware of those things, but I don't think that means that he doesn't understand the importance of Blücher and the Prussians, but that doesn't mean he's also not going to use those things to benefit him at home. So the Prussians would say, or from the Prussian perspective or whatever, it comes off as purposeful, right? They're suspicious of Wellington. And a lot of the suspicion is the political, right? Like, what is he doing to benefit himself on this larger political scheme? Not necessarily the military. Like, yes, Blücher's worried that because Wellington gets held up at Quatre Bras, and he doesn't come to reinforce him. So, there's suspicion there of, is it purposeful? Are they doing it? So there is suspicion of that, but it's tied into the political components, if you will, that are infecting or kind of impacting those command. So I think it can be both. Because when I read accounts of the Prussian, like even Prussian or British, when you're reading those, there's a recognition that Waterloo isn't the success it is without any of the parts, right?
Absolutely.
If Blücher and the Prussians don't show up when they do, if the King's German Legion doesn't hold the defensive of La Haye as well as they do for as long as they do. So I think on that level, there's a clear understanding. But then when you get the politics, that adds another component. And I think it can be both.
Yeah,
I think Wellington can be conscious of it being both.
Blücher definitely had it right, I think, when he suggested that Waterloo should really be called the Battle of La Belle Alliance, just for that wonderful metaphor.
And see, that's the politics, right? Where they don't go with that, and they go with Waterloo and centering the narrative. That's what I was talking about with historical memory and centering the narrative, right? And the British do it amazingly. They are incredibly effective at it, and this has been true. Like, Waterloo's not their first you know, experience with that. But I do think on that military level, though, they recognize that. I mean, there's so many good stories of, even with the suspicion between Wellington and Blucher, there's so many good stories of this kind of camaraderie they have. Like at one point when they're meeting right, before the battle, during Waterloo, there's a story of Blucher bear hugging Wellington. There's a respect there.
I'd have loved to see Wellington's face if that actually
mean,
happened.
I know, I like to think so. But I always try to humanize these moments. Like, some of the people I respect the most are some of the people I fight with the most. But the reason I respect them the most is because we can have those really tough conversations that need to be had to get the best out of whatever it is. So you can mistrust and be suspicious of intentions and, all of those things, and still respect the military. And I think that comes through a lot. It's just the political finagling, if you will, that recast it, right? The memory. And it's so quick to happen. Like, it happens right then. It's not like this is a historical memory that's rewritten, like 40 years after the Battle of Waterloo or anything like that.
True. That's true.
It's something that is happening in real time, the way they think about it, the way they cast it.
But I mean, it's interesting what you say about how Britain, even by this point, has kind of previous in doing this sort of thing, because of course they've had, even in the short term, a lot of practice at that with the Peninsular War, where inevitably they won't have gone to great lengths to emphasize that it's an Anglo-Portuguese army and the Spanish contingents that had deployed in the battle. So perhaps in some senses it's just a continuation of what they're used to doing.
For me, because I read a lot of diplomatic correspondence, right? So there's a lot of feelings being put out there that maybe necessarily, they're writing to the foreign minister, so they just tell them whatever they have, and vice versa, and it's present there. The way Grenville writes, the way Hawkesbury writes, the way the envoys write, is that this is Britain saving Europe. And there's good and bad to that. The British have to believe that. That's what's driving them. You know what I mean? That's motivation. That's a lot. But I think that's how they see themselves. Of course, the continent, that's where you get into conflict with the British, because they see themselves as saving the British. When you think of Prussians and all the rest of the German troops, but they see it that way, or they talk about it that way. Let's say that the language that they use is that, and I think it plays into what you're talking about, the emphasizing the British, because if it's not troops, it's British money.
This is true.
Right?
Yeah.
Or subsidizing. So I think that kind of goes into the British perspective. Well, it may not just be our troops, it's British money. The reason you're fielding your troops is still Britain.
We paid for it, sort of thing, so therefore they're kind of ours.
But, wrong or right, that's not what I'm not really commenting on that. But I do think that is, that's the way they see this. And that goes into that, it's a British versus French war. I love this stuff. I love talking about these dynamics of perceptions.
That definitely comes across. What's the perception of Waterloo out in the USA?
I love this question. I love this question because it's really not. But I want to explain it. It's really not a thing. And when I say that, there may be, if you talk to other Americans, maybe they would have a different answer for you. But I'm trying to think of, you said popular perception, so like public perception. I'm trying to not think of the people who are non-historians who know me, because that doesn't count. Right? Or my friend groups who are also Napoleonicist or anything like that. I'm talking about your average American citizen and how they would perceive it. And if I walked to somebody and said, what does Waterloo mean to you? There's a few things that might happen. One, they might say ABBA, right? The ABBA song, Waterloo.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
going to be
I'm with
one.
you. Yeah.
They might be like, are you talking about Waterloo, Iowa, which is a city in Iowa? It wasn't originally named Waterloo, but it becomes Waterloo. Or I'm in Texas, so they may say, are you talking about Waterloo Records, which is a record store in Austin, Texas? But I don't think that they would automatically think of the Battle of Waterloo. Now, if I said the Battle of Waterloo, they would say, yeah, I've heard of it. They may not have heard of it, but if they had, they may have heard of it, but they wouldn't really know a lot. Wellington, kind of expand here. If I said, do you know Wellington? They'd be like, do you mean beef Wellington, the food, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
That might be their first thing. And they may have heard of him, but I wouldn't expect it. Napoleon, they do. And that's because of American history, right? This is the kind of larger legacy, if you will, of Napoleon, that it's wider than just Europe. And that's because in U.S. History instruction, they are introduced to Napoleon. Also Napoleon on popular television programs, right? They always throw in like a Napoleon character, like is identifiably Napoleon. So in American instruction, they would hear about Napoleon. They would hear about Haitian Revolution, was huge, had huge ramifications for American slavery and the way America responded to revolts of their enslaved. And then of course, Napoleon trying to recapture it. So that's kind of in the narrative. Then you have, of course, the American French, right? The American competition with Britain and France as far as commerce goes. You have the quasi-war between America and France. And then, of course, you have the selling of the Louisiana Territory to the Americans. So these are some of the ways that they are introduced to Napoleon in a broad way. And that's only if they're paying attention. So Waterloo specifically, maybe they've heard of it, but it does not nearly have the same interest or impact, symbolism as it does in Britain or in Europe itself.
Yeah,
And America's massive. America's massive. Like talking about America's multiple countries in one thing, so you go to different regions, you might find different people, who know, but as a broad culture, no. I would say that.
Interesting. I think in a way there's a similar situation here in the UK because it's not taught in schools at all. You can quite easily go through your secondary school. Yeah. And it doesn't appear. People, the last compulsory year of history education, which for our lot is 14 years old, it is all effectively 20th century conflicts. So World War I, World War II, Cold War. Before that, we kind of do the Tudors, the Stuarts, if you probably just bypass the Glorious Revolution even, and you just jump straight into...
Really? Sorry,
yeah.
I'm like...
you get the British Empire in there and the controversies and the Empire in India particularly.
Yeah.
You might get a little bit of sort of the scramble for Africa at the tail end of the 19th century, but 19th century history just gets written out apart from that. And you just sort of jump in at sort of 1914.
Well, in my classes, when I teach American history, because at university, our university system's different. So all American students, because it's not as specialized, right? You go to university and it's broader. So they all have American survey. So if they have me, I give them way too much extra information about Europe because honestly, I need them to know that America is like this on the large spectrum for, pretty much the entirety until we get to the Second World War. But I do bring in a lot more of that. For context, right? The War of 1812 isn't happening in a bubble, so I bring up Waterloo. Well, we don't get to talk about it in detail, but I do bring up that while the British are having to deal and wrap up this conflict with America, that they are simultaneously having to reorganize, a new coalition to respond to Napoleon coming back. So I always try to drop those things in, but because we have discretion, we can kind of include what we want. But generally speaking, no. There's an ignorance, if you will, of you know, we could argue about history and people not really paying attention to it a lot. But that is going to be one of the things that kind of falls through. But I think it's an interesting question, and I really enjoy thinking about it. Now I'm going to ask people. Now it's going to be like man on the street interviews, and I'm going to be like, hey.
One final question, because we have quite a few people who follow the Napoleonicist online who have an interest in the War of 1812. And it's an interesting one because Britain always thinks of the USA and the UK having this really close special relationship. But in the process, just kind of neglect the fact that not only the Americans probably don't perceive it in quite the same way, but also that in the early days of the of US history, the relationship is incredibly fractious between the two nations, as the War of 1812 kind of demonstrates. How is the War of 1812 thought about in the US?
Oh, yeah, no, it's a good question. Because we think of that, like you said, the Anglo, the American British connection is really comes into its full in the 20th century. And in America, a lot of scholarship and scholars themselves see the War of 1812 as a continuation of the American Revolution. In a lot of ways, the War of 1812 is deciding some of the things that were left open, right, with the American Revolution. So there's things with the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that they make agreements, right? The British promised to leave all of the forts in the Northwest Territory. The Americans promised to provide the loyalists, like give them back their property and their territory and all of those things. If they want to, they also promised to pay back the money. Right? So in case you were wondering if it was really about taxes, okay, they promised to pay back all that money. And there's a lot of those things that they promise that they don't do. The British don't leave the forts, in the Northwest Territory. And so it's kind of an interesting period where you have the beginnings of American government, right? They have to figure themselves out. They have the Articles of Confederation, which fails. They have then the establishment of the Constitution. So there's this period where the Americans are trying to figure out a working government. But in those times, a lot of the problems with Britain that were already happening were continuing to happen. So especially in the 1790s, you have the British seizing American merchant ships, you have the impressment of American sailors, you have all these things, and these were things that were already going on. In the 1790s, America can't really do much about it. They signed the awful, what the Americans call the Jays Treaty, where they send John Jay to England, and he basically gives exclusive trading rights to Britain, right? Kind of under duress, if you will. So they have no negotiating power. They try to walk this fine line. They don't want to make France angry. They don't want to make the British angry. And then signing this exclusive trading rights with Britain, that starts the quasi-war. With France. And so all of these things are happening this whole period, and they keep happening, and they start happening again in, around 1800s, 1812s. And by this point, America is in a much better position. There's some stability, if you will, in their government. You have had actual peaceful passing of governmental power from one party to the next, right? Because you have Washington and Adams, who are considered Federalists, because you don't have the party system isn't the same. And then you have that transition to power in 1800 to Jefferson, who's a Jeffersonian Republican. And then, of course, Madison, who is president during the War of 1812. And so all of these problems with Britain, what America would say violating American rights, the British violating American rights, have been happening. And so you have this kind of culmination in the War of 1812. And so that's why this is one of those historiographical arguments. Some people would disagree. Some people even argue that the American Civil War is a continuation of the disagreements that Americans had even in this revolutionary period. So it's dealing with Britain. And so the kind of way it's taught a lot is that, because the war changes nothing, right? The War of 1812, it reverts back to status quo. Like no territories gained, there's no obvious benefit, if you will. But the argument is that it made Britain finally recognize that America is a power in its own right. Maybe not the power that we're going to see in the 20th century or anything like that, but they are a sovereign nation, who will protect, who will defend their territory. And so you have less conflict between the two after that. It doesn't mean they're always on the same page, but you don't have this same problem of impressment and attacking commerce and kind of this antagonistic, it almost feels antagonistically familial relationship. And so at the end of it, you have less problems with that. So that's why you kind of see that extension. It's establishing those things that they thought that they are already established or had already agreed to.
Hayley, it's been an absolute joy talking to you.
I hope so. I hope everybody enjoys it.
I'm sure they will. It's been a fantastic way to kick off the interviews. I know people have learned a huge amount. So thank you so much for joining me for Waterloo Remembered.
And I do suggest that if anybody has a chance, specifically with the King's German Legion, because there's so much going on in that conflict of the defense of La Haye Sainte, and so much more detail that we didn't get into, all the dynamics, the setting the thatch on the barn on fire and the clamoring to put out the fire. There's so many small things that we have evidence for and we have, detailed analysis for, that I do suggest, even for popular audience. I mean, Brendan Simms' book is written for a popular audience, but The Longest Afternoon is specifically about that, where he takes it blow by blow and it's really into the details. So I recommend that to anyone who wants to have kind of a play-by-play, if you will, of the defense that we weren't able to necessarily get into in our, brief discussion of the event itself.
That was the historian Hayley Stewart discussing the role of German troops within Wellington's army at Waterloo. You can follow Hayley on Twitter at Hayley A. Stewart. If you have any questions or comments, remember that you can get involved on Twitter using the hashtag Waterloo Remembered or in the forum at thenapoleonicwars.net, where you will find a dedicated room for Waterloo Remembered. Join me tomorrow for the second instalment in this triple bill of Forgotten Foreign Forces as I speak to Professor Alithia Lasborough about Spain during the War of the Seventh Coalition. Until then, I'm Zach White. This has been Waterloo Remembered from The Napoleonicist. Take care, my friends. Stay safe. And as always, thank you for listening.
Hi, this is Craig Robinson from Ways to Win, and support for this podcast comes from Invesco QQQ. Invesco QQQ is proud to sponsor this episode, and even prouder to provide access to innovation for the last 25 years. Basketball has had innovations over the years, too. We're seeing the game played in new ways every day. Learn more at Invesco.com/QQQ. Let's rethink possibility. Invesco Distributors, Inc.
Hi, I'm Daniel, founder of Pretty Litter. Cats and cat owners deserve better than any old-fashioned litter. That's why I teamed up with scientists and veterinarians to create Pretty Litter. Its innovative crystal formula has superior odor control and weighs up to 80% less than clay litter. Pretty Litter even monitors health by changing colors to help detect early signs of potential illness. It's the world's smartest kitty litter.
Go to prettylitter.com and use code ACAST for 20% off your first order and a free cat toy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.
Even when we're on a budget, we still deserve nice things. Quince is a place to scoop up stunning high-end goods for 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They have buttery soft cashmere sweaters starting at $50, luxurious Italian leather bags, and so much more. Plus, Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get the high-end goods you'll love without the high price tag with Quince. Go to quince.com/style for free shipping and 365-day returns.